I want to thank the choir for being so on top of everything today. There's a lot of new service music, and that first hymn that we did, I bind unto myself today, as my favorite hymn. So if I die before the sermon is over, we got to sing it again, all right? Fair warning. So today, as I said before, it's Trinity Sunday, and I'm not going to get into the ins and outs of the doctrine of the Trinity at all, but I do want to talk about how the Trinity can be symbolic and reflective of an important aspect of the nature of God, which is relationship. The nature of God is relationship, and it's also one of giving. The way that I look at the Trinity image-wise is three bowls of water existing on the same plane somehow, and one of them spills over into the other bowl, and that causes that bowl to spill over into the third bowl, and somehow the third bowl spills back into the first bowl. Because I think the water, whatever image you want to use, that flows between the persons of the Trinity is love. It's God's love. It's the love of God. It's God's grace. And that love, that grace, that God stuff, whatever language you want to use for it, is something that is abundant. It overflows. It floods things so as to know no boundaries. So whatever boundaries we want to put up between ourselves, between a person and another person, or between groups of people, between ideologies or thoughts, that love of God, that grace, kind of knocks down those walls like a flood, because it is always flowing and it is always more than we can ask for or handle. You know, for me, that's the true nature of God, is that it's giving. It's a grace that keeps on flowing and keeps on giving. And so we are called to do the same. We are called to be giving people. We are called to give. We are called to sacrifice for others. We are called to put others' concerns ahead of our own, which frankly isn't always easy to do. And even if you just think about the ethics of that problem, to think about saying, well, if the greater good for me is one thing, but the greater good for community is something else, how do I make that decision? Winston Churchill said something that's always resonated with me. He said, play for more than you can afford to lose, and that way you'll learn the meaning of the game. I paraphrase it somewhat and I say, give more than you think is prudent, and that way you will know the value of giving. You know, it's kind of serendipitous that we're celebrating Trinity Sunday on the same weekend that we honor our fallen with Memorial Day, because we think about brave men and women in our armed forces who have laid down their lives and died for their country. John 15, Jesus says that love has no greater one than this, than to lay down one's life for one's friends. And we see that in so many instances, those of you who are associated with the military. And it's important to note that men and women are still suffering and still dying for love of country. We might not be called to pick up a rifle or to stand a post or to serve our country in that way, but there are other ways in which you sacrifice for other people. So many of you I know of take care of your parents in some meaningful way. You look after them, you live with them, you look after their needs. So many of you do that for your children as you raise them, and maybe after you've raised them, you take care of them, you look out for them, you do things for them. You put their interests ahead of yours, oftentimes. Even in your own interpersonal relationships with peers or with coworkers, how many times during a week do you allow someone else to get the glory for maybe work that you've done? How many times do you put someone else's concerns ahead of yours? I think that is part of what we're always wired to do. We're not wired to be selfish people. We're actually, I think, hardwired to be giving, generous people. And this is part of the nature of God that's exhibited in the Trinity. You know, the other part is about relationship. And it's about the relationship that we have with one another. And I think it's important to note that studies have shown that people in their 20s and 30s the millennials as they're called, they are more concerned not about doctrine or dogma in a church, but they're really concerned about relationships. They're concerned about how a community of faith that calls itself a community of faith deals with relationships in and among themselves. Are there strong relationships? How are relationships built and nurtured? What are those relationships pointing towards? I think it's important because that's how we're going to attract more people in their 20s and more people in their 30s here, is by exhibiting those kinds of self-giving, self-sacrificing relationships. And I can think of a handful of examples just right now of the way that plays out here at St. Margaret's Church. You know, I look over here at the choir. It's a small group of people, but every week they gather and they rehearse and they sing, and then they share joys and concerns. And they look out for one another. They call each other on the phone. They visit each other in the hospital. And they look out for each other's concerns. Our knitting group, which meets the first Saturday of every month over in the conference room in the admin building, that's a small group of people that really care a lot about each other. As they knit, as they sew, what they do is they talk about their joys and concerns and their pains in life. And they care for each other and they nurture each other. You know, so much of our youth program is built around peer mentoring that if you're a parent with a kid who always seems to be making the wrong decision, you show up on Monday night to our pick and mix, you're probably going to find a dozen other parents who are in the same boat. And you can talk about it with them. And you say, you know, my kid does this. It drives me crazy. Am I alone? And they'll say, no, you're not alone. We're in the same boat as you are. We've got a small group, kind of an ad hoc group of women who've lost their husbands in the last couple of years. And they support each other. They care for each other. They look out for each other. And if one of them is hurting, all of them are hurting. You know, I think that's a real mark of a strong Christian community, and you all exhibit in so many ways. Martin Buber was a wonderful theologian. He wrote that God exists between people. So in that, where there are two people gathered, God is there with them. God is there between them. And that is the nature of the Trinity, is that God exists within relationships. So when you relate to someone else, when you love someone else, when you put someone else ahead of you, when you sacrifice something that's important to you so that someone else might live, when you give more of yourself than you think is prudent so that others might live, then you are exhibiting a real strong nature of God in your life. It's what we celebrate this Memorial Day. It's also what we celebrate this Trinity Sunday. This nature of God that gives until no more can be given, and then more is given, because with God there is abundance. It's this nature of God that says that we're called to relate to one another, to love one another by giving to one another. Amen.